Hello, and welcome to the North Coast Journal Preview. This is a show where we take a look at what's coming to the current edition of the North Coast Journal. I am your host, Tanya Schrum, and we are joined by North Coast Journal's news editor, Thad Greenson, and arts and features editor, Jennifer Fumiko Cahill. Hello, and welcome to you both. I hope you're staying dry.
Staying inside, Tanya.
Yeah.
It's the surefire way. The only way.
Staying dry and staying away from the creek beds because they will rise. Well, speaking of rising tides, we have a bit of a interesting story brought to us, the cover this week by Jennifer. And would you like to fill us in on all of the spicy details?
Spicy indeed. So this week's cover story is about Mazzottis. You may have heard they closed on January 11th was the first night that they shut down, and they never reopened. And I'll be honest, this was not the story that I had gone in thinking I was going to write. You can only plan so much because as you interview people, as you learn things, a story changes sometimes. But this was really a big shift. I have talked to Joe Mazzotti a lot of times over the last decade or so about running restaurants, about the changing economy, about the renovation. And Mazzotti's is a real iconic fixture on the North Coast. For one, the one in Eureka was something like 42 years old when it shut a couple of years ago. And the one in Arcata, I think, opened in 2002. Is that right? I have it in the story. And the recent renovation, it was such an iconic thing in people's minds. People had their graduation dinners there. People had their, birthday celebrations. They had regular, Thursday night dinners there. It was a real part of community socializing, right? Part of what you think of as a town is partly characterized by its restaurants, the places where you go and have either contained or expanded social moments, bars, clubs, restaurants. Those things matter in terms of the character of a place. And Mazzotti's is a big part of that. And so when it was renovated, lots of people were like, had feelings about how it should look, et cetera, because they're invested. And so I went in to cover the closing of Mazzotti's, partly to talk about, factors in the closing, but also to talk about how it impacts employees. 40 people were working at Mazzotti's when it closed. That's how many employees they have. And, I often feel like if a business leaves town or closes that has 40 employees, right? Everybody's like, oh my God, all those jobs. But when a restaurant closes, people are like, oh, where am I going to get that butter? And we kind of forget, we think of it as easy to move from restaurant to restaurant for a job, or we think about it as like not a permanent career job to be a server or to be a cook, to be a chef, etc. But they are. These are people who are supporting families. These are people who are, paying rent like everybody else. And losing their job has made a big deal for them. And I should preface this by saying that in all the time that I have interviewed people about, I've done stories on people who throw sex parties. I've done stories on, people who have literally sat across from me and told me about crimes they've committed. But I have never had a more cautious or secretive group of people to interview than restaurant workers, going over multiple stories. And this group is really shy and really takes anonymity seriously because it's a small county, and moving from place to place, all you have is your reputation. And if you have a reputation as being a difficult worker, as being a problem, you might not get work, right? So it's a big deal. That said, as I talked to servers and cooks and, front of house and back of house workers, again, on condition of anonymity, it became more and more clear that the things that were happening were chronic issues and not just a recent development in the restaurant. And a lot of that had to do with Joe Mazzotti's choices. Now, I've talked to Joe before, and we talked for this story too about issues like, of course, COVID took a huge hit on restaurants. The pot industry, right? Cannabis, illegal cannabis had cash flowing through this county, and things changed irreversibly since then. And the price of cannabis dropping through the basement has definitely changed how much money people spend out, what kind of tips they leave, etc. And all of that affects a restaurant. All of that affects, and then inflation. And also, he was very adamant that the summer fires made a big dent in visitors to town and therefore restaurant traffic. And certainly those things, I think you can't argue that they didn't have impact. However, the restaurant workers that I spoke to were all telling the same story, which was that they were not getting their checks on time. They were sometimes getting checks that bounced. One person told me that their checks, about 50% of their checks over the time that they were employed at Mazzotti's, had some sort of problem. Either they had to wait to cash it, they were told it wouldn't work, or it was returned. They had a check bounce. They incurred late fees. And of course, that is a domino effect, right? And if you've worked in the restaurant industry, or although these days, any industry, lots of us are living check to check. And when you are living check to check, you don't have wiggle room. You don't have money saved up. And if you don't make rent, then you're going to get evicted. And if you get evicted, you have to move. In order to move, you need to have first and last month's rent and security deposit. It is expensive to be check to check. And more employees were complaining about this issue, going way back before the summer fires, going way back into, for some of them, their entire time at Mazzotti's was spent really chasing down their paychecks. And in talking with Joe Mazzotti about this, I think what struck me was not only the fact that he didn't deny that this was an issue. He does deny that it went on longer than a year, but that he really took a very, what I think is undeniably, I don't think you can describe it any other way than victim blaming approach. And his response was like, why are you still working here then? I saw text messages between him and workers who were saying, I still haven't gotten my check. It's been 5 days. I'm in trouble here. And he would say, listen, maybe this isn't a good job for you. Or, if you can't handle this. The response about his debts and about what he owed his workers was kind of shocking, in that he was very quick to say that it's their choice to work here, so kind of tough luck. That's how life is in restaurants. And from what I have learned talking to other restaurant workers and people who worked elsewhere besides Mazzotti's is that it is not like that at every restaurant. And
what impressed upon me is how devoted the workers were to each other, and that's what kept everything going. But I can't imagine any business being able to run effectively with that kind of good luck getting your paycheck.
Yeah, and I think that last month, between Christmas and early January, people were not getting their paychecks. People were not getting their paychecks at Christmas time. And people had worked, some of them, a month without a paycheck, essentially. 3 weeks to a month without a paycheck or with delayed paychecks, et cetera. And when employees came in on January 11th and discovered that their next paycheck was not going to clear either, and they weren't able to cash their last paychecks, and they were finding out that the next one wasn't going to clear either. And after a lot of texting back and forth, what I understood from the people that I spoke to is the cooks and the staff, the front of house staff, kind of came to, we can't do this anymore. And they walked out. And, previously in coverage of the closure of Mazzottis, it was described to me by Joe Mazzotti as a couple of people pulling a no-show, which was kind of, I think, the impetus for some people to feel like compelled to talk about it, because that makes the Mazzotti staff seem flaky or irresponsible, when in fact they had really gone above and beyond. Another thing that really struck me was what you said before, which is that they were really devoted to each other. And people were saying, well, I don't want to work for free, but if I don't come in, then so-and-so will be stuck, at the tables, at the bar, at the kitchen, on the line, will be stuck alone, and they'll be in trouble. It'll be harder for them. They won't be able to do a good job. They won't get tips. They won't be able to pay their rent. And there was a real loyalty to each other. As frustrated as they were with how the restaurant was being run and with Joe himself and his responses, they really wanted to stick together. Some of them said this was the best work family they'd ever had. And while it was the most unstable financially, it was the best experience they had working. And, people who do this work, they are, of course, in it to be paid and make ends meet, but also it's a very social kind of work, right? In order to serve people and do that well, you need to be a person who can get along with others, right? Including your customers. And, some of them too were feeling attachment to longtime customers. They're like, if I don't show up, it's going to be terrible. And my regular customers are going to be like, what happened? For the cooks, they were feeling frustrated about not being able to get ingredients because things were chaotic and the finances were chaotic in a way that affected what orders came in. And so, what produce and things like that they had available to be cooking with. And feeling like you can't do a good job and feeling like you are going to be judged on doing a poor job was really frustrating for them. And at the same time, there were other debts around town. So you may have heard about the fancy Wallace and Hines bar. Blue Lakes Wallace and Hines Bar Company makes those gorgeous wood bars. Like if you've been to the Eureka Theater, it's so pretty. But they made a bar, the total cost of which during that big renovation came to something like $130K. And that's just the bar and its attached equipment. The entire renovation, Joe Mazzotti estimated to me cost about $850,000. That's the number he gave me on the phone. And that's a lot of cost to recoup. And Wallace and Hines ended up taking him to court over a disputed amount that was unpaid. And they kind of expressed the same experience. I talked to Tom Tellez, the owner, and he was again, another person who was very hesitant to talk publicly, but he felt like the story was being portrayed in another way by Joe. And he felt he had to come out and say, this money was owed to us and everything was fine until we said, hey, we need to be paid. And then things really soured. During our interview, something that was really confusing was Joe said to me a couple of times, I could pay this off. I could pay all these employees. I could pay Wallace and Hines. I could pay, all my debts if I wanted to, because I have so much money or my family has so much money, and I could just make a phone call and it would be paid. And of course, my question is, why not? And it seemed to be a thing that he took as a personal code, something he just would not do. But essentially what he's doing now is, borrowing in a way, because they're unpaid, borrowing from working class people, right? People who are, working in the service industry, they already did the labor and they haven't got the money. Some of them ended up going, by the way, to food banks over the course of working at Mazzottis, but especially in that last month. Some of them ended up having to leave their apartments. One faced eviction, at least one. People had their phones turned off. People told me all kinds of stories about hardships related to this. Some of these folks have kids. It's been really difficult. And for them to hear him say, listen, I've got all these fantastic cars and things like that, the sort of bragging online about those things, and then also say, I could pay this, has been really demoralizing. And it's been added a layer of frustration to the business of finding a new job, trying to figure out if they should file a labor board claim, all the things you have to do when the scary thing of losing your job happens, and having it go this way when they were working for free with the hope that the restaurant would pull through and that they'd get paid, with the hope that they could keep their work family together. To have this kind of response was really painful for them. And it was honestly painful for me to hear. Like I said, this wasn't the story that I wanted to go in and write. And I didn't go into this story thinking I had a villain on my hands and I was going to, carve it out. It was, that we've had so many restaurants close, and my hope was to really kind of illuminate what happens when we see that, when we see the close sign, when we see the lights out, what's happening behind the scenes. But in this case, what was happening behind the scenes was not normal and pretty extreme, frankly.
And my heart just goes out to every one of those 40 employees. And I hope that they are living the best revenge of living well soon, that they find new work, and that some of the family can stay connected, because it is just heartbreaking. And it definitely surprised me, the details that you exposed in your article. And I really encourage everybody to pick up their copy of this week's North Coast Journal and read the entire article for themselves. And give a hand if you know anybody affected.
Tip your server.
And yeah, tip your server, folks. And just to button that article, there is a new Scooby-Doo type of person named Jack that apparently will be taking over the area.
That's true. Jack Wu.
Mazzottis.
So if you've been to Ginger, if you've been to Nori, if you've been to Jack's Seafood, Jack Wu owns a lot of restaurants here and out of state, and he's taking over the space. So Mazzottis in that location is done anyway. The business is not sold. The lease is taken over. So that means that Jack Wu will be moving in and starting another restaurant. I don't have any information about that or what it's going to be like. And it's going to be something new.
Well, thank you, and I'm sure you will bring us further details as they arrive. With that, we're going to switch over to Thad and let him illuminate some news articles that are also coming to this week's journal. Thad.
Yeah, thanks, Tanya. Unfortunately, one of them is not very illuminating. It is largely about our efforts to answer a question fruitlessly. But we continued this week to dig into the land exchange agreement between Eureka City Schools and AMG Communities Jacobs LLC. Those who have been following this will remember AMG is a LLC that was formed just a couple days before Eureka City Schools Board agreed to a property exchange agreement to offload the old Jacobs Middle School site, 8.3 acres of property in Eureka that has long been kind of blighted and the district has been looking to rid itself of. had been in negotiations with the California Highway Patrol for some months toward a purchase where the Highway Patrol is going to relocate its northern Humboldt headquarters there. But then kind of very abruptly switched to this deal with AMG, in which they are trading the Jacobs campus for $5.3 million in cash and a small residential property on I Street in Eureka. Everything about this deal is kind of atypical, and so we've been trying to kind of run down who exactly is involved and why and what the plans are. And we really ran into a roadblock last week, and kind of the roadblock became a story in and of itself, of trying to figure out who are the principals, who are the people behind this new LLC, who are the real investors who are going to be developing this property. And they had put up a website called, I think it's the jacobscommunity.com or something similar, but kind of with a brief FAQ about who they are and what their plans are for the property. They say there's no firm plans yet. They're going to gather community input. And they, on that website, they kind of presented themselves as a small investment firm that has various business and real estate interests and forms single-purpose LLCs for each of these. And so the natural follow-up question for us is, okay, well, who's this investment firm? Can we get a name so we can do some background? And what other projects have you been involved in? What developments or other, similar acquisitions can you point to that we can, kind of see how those went? And there was some kind of bizarre back and forth with spokesperson for AMG. And so initially they kind of responded to our request, not answering, who this firm is, but instead saying that AMG is made up of, a private group of individual and family investors. And I was like, okay, well, that's different than a small investment firm. So who are these folks? And basically they've declined to say. They're not legally bound to tell us, and they cited attorney-client privilege, which is kind of a fancy way of saying our clients don't want to tell you. So we know, but we can't tell you because our clients haven't given us permission. So it's kind of curious. I was kind of going back and forth with somebody on Facebook about this, and they were kind of saying that's normal. And, in everything that I've seen, both in my 20 years of reporting on local governments up here, but then just in kind of searching around, I can't find another situation like this where there's an entity that has moved in to buy a public property from a public entity and hasn't kind of released its identity and hasn't kind of said who's behind the effort and why. So what we've been told is, that it's, again, a private group, and that they've declined to say whether they're local or out of the area. They've declined to say who they are, and they've declined to point to any other projects that these folks have been affiliated with. The one thing they have repeatedly said is that Rob Arkley is not involved, which we've never actually asked them, but they keep kind of going out of their way to say it. Rob Arkley is obviously the owner and founder of Security National, which is the company that is bankrolling the Housing for All initiative in Eureka and the Citizens for a Better Eureka lawsuits against the city, trying to block the city's plans for turning parking lots into residential developments downtown.
And it sounds like the crab walk continues.
Yeah, we will continue trying to answer these questions until we actually are able to, but it's looking like that might be a while.
We should get one of those little calendars that says like how many days we've gone without an answer.
Indeed. And I should say, anybody wanting to weigh in on this agreement or any aspects of it, it will be discussed in closed session by the Eureka City Schools Board tomorrow night, Thursday. But there will be a public comment period. So if people want to go kind of say their piece, that is the venue to do so.
And see if anybody shows up in long cloaks.
Maybe.
Well, that is about the time that we have for this week. I know we kind of dug in deep, but I want everybody to pick up this week's journal and read it cover to cover. Or, of course, you can always go find it on the northcoastjournal.com. It is available on newsstands today, so everybody pick up your copy. And with that, I am Tanya Schrum. Thanks for being with us. Thanks to Jennifer and Thad for all of your hard work and reporting to us. And thank you for being with us and staying informed and supportive of our North Coast community. Thank you all.